exposing my wife's affair, how I fought back and won in court, my true revenge story. Imagine being blindsided by the person you love most, someone you trusted with your entire life. Ethan Wright, a skilled heart surgeon, lived the perfect life, an amazing career, two bright children, and what seemed like a loving marriage to his wife, Laura. But behind the scenes, Laura was plotting something far more sinister than Ethan could have ever imagined. While he was saving lives in the operating room, she was planning to destroy his, not just by ending their marriage, but by accusing him of abuse, taking everything he had worked so hard for, and running off with her secret lover, a lover who had been using wealthy women as stepping stones for years. Ethan's world began to crumble when he first uncovered the affair, but instead of letting his anger consume him, he did something unexpected. He stayed calm. He didn't confront Laura immediately. He didn't shout or threaten her. Instead, he decided to wait and gather proof, knowing that one wrong move could cost him everything. What started as heartbreak soon turned into a carefully calculated mission for justice. This is a story of betrayal, but it's also a story of revenge, served cold and precise. Ethan wasn't about to let his wife and her lover destroy his life, and in the end, they would get exactly what they deserved. But how did Ethan manage to stay so calm? How did he uncover all the details of their wicked plan? And most importantly, how did he ensure that karma would hit them so hard that they would never recover? Stick around as we unravel this intense, emotional journey of betrayal, heartbreak, and justice. This is the story of Ethan Wright, a man who didn't just survive betrayal, but came out stronger than ever. The marriage and early signs of betrayal. Ethan and Laura's marriage wasn't always filled with deceit. In fact, it started off like most love stories, with hope, excitement, and dreams of a bright future. They met through friends, and from the moment they locked eyes, there was an undeniable connection. Ethan admired Laura's charm, her confidence, and how easily she fit into his life. Laura, on the other hand, seemed to appreciate Ethan's calm demeanor and his passion for his work as a surgeon. Their early years together were happy. They traveled, they built a home, and they welcomed two beautiful children into the world, Emma and Lime. To everyone on the outside, they were the picture-perfect family. Ethan had a thriving career, and Laura appeared to be a devoted wife and mother. But as the years went on, small cracks started to appear in their relationship. At first, it was subtle. Laura became distant, distracted even. She spent more time away from home, saying she was busy with social commitments or taking on more responsibilities with the kids' extracurricular activities. Ethan, always consumed by his demanding job, didn't immediately notice the change. He was often in the hospital, performing surgeries that required his full attention. But when he did come home, there was something different about Laura. She was colder, less interested in spending time together. Conversations that used to flow easily between them now felt forced. When Ethan would ask how her day was, Laura would brush him off with short, vague answers. At first, Ethan chalked it up to stress. After all, raising two teenagers wasn't easy, and he knew that his job often left her feeling like she was shouldering most of the parenting duties. But as time passed, it became harder to ignore the growing distance between them. The real turning point came when Ethan started noticing Laura's frequent absences at odd times. She'd leave the house without much explanation, saying she had errands or was meeting up with friends. But her stories never quite added up. There were nights when she'd come home late, her excuse being that she had lost track of time. Ethan didn't want to believe the worst. He trusted Laura, and despite their strained relationship, he still loved her. Then there was Dylan, the tennis coach. He had started working with their kids, Emma and Lime, to improve their tennis skills. At first, he seemed like a harmless, friendly guy. But soon, Ethan noticed how often Dylan would linger around after lessons, chatting with Laura. There was something unsettling about how comfortable they seemed with each other. Ethan tried to push the thought out of his mind. After all, Laura had known Dylan for a while through the kids' activities. What could possibly be wrong? But there were too many little signs that Ethan couldn't ignore. The secretive phone calls, the way Laura would smile when Dylan was around, and the subtle changes in her behavior. All of it pointed to something more. Ethan's gut was telling him that something was off, but he wasn't ready to face it yet. He hoped it was all in his head, that he was overthinking things. He wanted to believe that his wife wasn't capable of betraying him. And yet deep down, he knew that things were unraveling. The woman he had married was slipping away from him, and it wasn't just because of the stresses of daily life. There was something much darker lurking beneath the surface, something he hadn't yet fully uncovered. It wasn't long before Ethan's suspicions were confirmed in the most heartbreaking way. The life he thought he knew, the woman he thought he knew, was about to be torn apart by a betrayal so deep that it would change everything. The revelation. Ethan's suspicions had been building for months. Every small sign, every unexplained absence, every cold response from Laura felt like another piece of the puzzle falling into place. But no matter how much he tried to convince himself that it was all in his head, deep down, he knew the truth. Something was very wrong. One evening, while Laura was out, supposedly at one of her social commitments, Ethan found himself alone in their quiet house. The kids were at a friend's, and for the first time in a while, the silence felt deafening. He sat at the kitchen table, his mind racing with all the little things that hadn't made sense recently. And then something snapped inside him. He couldn't live in this uncertainty anymore. He had to know the truth. Without giving it much thought, Ethan picked up Laura's tablet. She often left it lying around the house, and it wasn't password protected. His heart raced as he tapped the screen, feeling an uneasy mix of guilt and desperation. He didn't want to invade her privacy, but he needed answers. He had to know if his fears were real or if he was losing his mind. At first, there was nothing unusual, just emails, reminders for appointments, and messages with friends. But then he found something that made his stomach drop. A series of texts between Laura and Dylan. The messages were hidden under a contact name that looked like one of her friends. But when he opened the thread, it was clear who she was really talking to. The texts were flirtatious at first, filled with jokes and playful banter. But as Ethan scrolled further back, the conversation became more intimate. They talked about meeting up in secret, about the future they were planning together, about how they needed to be patient until the time was right. It was all there. Confirmation that Laura had been lying to him, deceiving him, and planning a life with another man behind his back. Ethan felt like he had been punched in the gut. His whole world spun as he read each message, each word cutting deeper than the last. There was no denying it now. His wife, the woman he had built a life with, was having an affair. And it wasn't just a fling. This was something planned, calculated. She had been plotting this for months, if not longer. But the worst part wasn't the affair itself. It was the realization that Laura was planning to destroy him in the process. Scrolling through the messages, Ethan saw that they had been discussing their strategy. Laura wanted to wait until after their kids' college tuition was fully paid off before filing for divorce. But it wasn't just about ending their marriage. Laura was planning to accuse Ethan of domestic abuse, a lie that would not only tarnish his reputation, but potentially ruin his career as a surgeon. She wanted to take everything from him, their home, his money, his future. And Dylan was fully on board. He encouraged her, talked about how they could live off Ethan's money while painting him as the villain. It wasn't just about breaking Ethan's heart. It was about leaving him with nothing. For a moment, Ethan just sat there, staring at the screen, his mind numb from the shock. This wasn't some nightmare he could wake up from. This was real. And his wife, the woman he had once loved and trusted, was at the center of it all. The betrayal was overwhelming. How could she do this to him? How could she do this to their children? Ethan's first instinct was to confront her, to demand answers, to unleash all the anger and pain that was building up inside of him. But something held him back. If Laura was capable of plotting this kind of scheme, she would be ready for him to explode. She wanted him to lose control, to lash out, so she could use it against him. Ethan realized that he couldn't give her that satisfaction. He couldn't let his emotions get the best of him. If he confronted her now, without any solid evidence, she could turn everything against him. He needed to be smart. He needed to think this through. With a heavy heart, Ethan closed the messages and put the tablet down. The truth was out in the open now, but it wasn't time to act yet. He would have to gather more evidence, more proof, before confronting her. And when the time came, he would be ready. He wouldn't let Laura and Dylan destroy his life. He would fight back, but he would do it on his terms. Calmly, carefully, and with all the strength he could muster. This was just the beginning of a long, painful journey. But in that moment, Ethan made a promise to himself. No matter what it took, he would come out of this stronger. He wouldn't let Laura and her lover tear him apart. He would find a way to survive this betrayal, and in the end, they would be the ones to pay for their deceit. Gathering evidence. After discovering the truth, Ethan knew there was no turning back. His heart ached, but his mind was clear. He couldn't confront Laura just yet, not without solid proof. If she was capable of plotting such an elaborate scheme, she was likely prepared to twist any situation in her favor. The texts alone weren't enough. He needed undeniable evidence that would hold up in court. Ethan began to approach the situation the way he approached difficult surgeries, methodically, carefully, and without letting his emotions get in the way. It was one of the hardest things he had ever done, but he knew that reacting too soon could cost him everything. Laura had already laid the groundwork to paint him as the villain, and he couldn't afford to give her any more ammunition. The first thing Ethan did was make copies of the messages he had found on Laura's tablet. He took screenshots of every incriminating text between her and Dylan, making sure to save multiple copies in different locations. He didn't want to risk Laura discovering his plans. If she knew he was onto her, she might act even more recklessly, and he couldn't let that happen. But the messages were just the beginning. Ethan needed more. He needed to show that Laura's betrayal wasn't just emotional, but also financial. He suspected that she had been quietly siphoning off money for months, perhaps even longer, to prepare for the life she planned to live with Dylan. It was a chilling thought, his own wife stealing from him while pretending everything was fine. Ethan decided to start by looking through their bank accounts and financial statements. Late one night, after Laura had gone to bed, he sat down at the computer and began to dig. He combed through months of transactions, looking for anything that seemed out of place. At first, everything appeared normal. Household expenses, payments for the kids' school, the usual day-to-day purchases. But then he found it. A series of withdrawals, small enough to go unnoticed, but frequent enough to raise alarm bells. Laura had been transferring money into an account Ethan didn't recognize, little by little. It wasn't a lot at once, but over time, it added up. The account was under her name alone, and she had been careful to keep the amounts just under the threshold that might attract attention. She had been building a financial safety net, preparing for the day when she would leave Ethan and start her new life with Dylan. The discovery was another blow, but it also gave Ethan a sense of clarity. This wasn't just an affair. Laura had been planning to tear their family apart for a long time, and she had done it with chilling precision. But now, Ethan had proof, evidence that would expose her lies in court. Still, Ethan knew that financial records and text messages weren't enough. He needed more, something that would show the full extent of Laura's deceit. He decided to hire a private investigator, someone who could discreetly gather information without tipping Laura off. It wasn't an easy decision. Ethan hated the idea of spying on his own wife, but he knew he had no other choice. The investigator, a man named Jack, was experienced and understood the sensitivity of the situation. Jack began tracking Laura's movements, following her to and from her social commitments and meetings with Dylan. Within a few weeks, Jack had gathered enough evidence to paint a clear picture of Laura's affair. He had photos, videos, and detailed logs of every meeting between Laura and Dylan. There was no more room for doubt. As the evidence piled up, Ethan felt a strange mix of emotions. There was relief. Finally, he had the proof he needed to protect himself and his children. But there was also deep sadness. This was the woman he had once loved, the mother of his children, and now she was nothing more than a stranger conspiring to destroy him. How had it come to this? How had their marriage fallen apart so completely, so quietly, without him realizing until it was too late? But even in the midst of his pain, Ethan knew he had to stay focused. The evidence was important, but there was still one more crucial step. He had to tell Emma and Liam the truth. This was the part that Ethan dreaded the most. He didn't want to hurt his children, but he couldn't let them be blindsided by their mother's lies. They deserved to know what was happening, and Ethan needed their support in the difficult battle that lay ahead. One evening, after another day of collecting evidence and pretending everything was normal, Ethan sat Emma and Liam down in the living room. His heart raced as he looked at their innocent faces, knowing that what he was about to say would shatter their world. But they had to hear it from him. They had to understand the truth, even if it hurt. "Kids, there's something I need to tell you," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "It's about your mother." Both Emma and Liam looked up at him, confused. They had sensed the tension in the house for months, but neither of them had ever imagined that something so terrible was happening behind the scenes. Ethan took a deep breath and began to explain, carefully, gently, but truthfully. He told them about the affair, about the financial betrayal, about the lies Laura had been telling. At first, the kids didn't want to believe it. How could their mother do something like this? How could she tear their family apart? But as Ethan showed them the evidence, the messages, the bank records, the photos, they realized there was no denying the truth. Their mother had betrayed them too. Emma and Lion were devastated. They cried, they asked questions, and they tried to make sense of it all. But through it all, they stood by their father. They understood that Ethan hadn't wanted any of this, that he was trying to protect them from a situation he hadn't created. In that moment, Ethan felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. There was still a courtroom battle ahead, and there was no telling how Laura would react once she realized her plan had been uncovered. But for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like he wasn't facing this nightmare alone. He had his children by his side, and together they would face whatever came next. Confronting the children, telling Emma and Liam the truth was the hardest thing Ethan had ever faced. They were his world, and he had always done everything in his power to protect them. But how could he protect them from this? From the heartbreak of learning that their mother, the woman they had loved and trusted, had been lying to them? For days, Ethan had wrestled with the decision. Part of him wanted to shield them from the truth, to pretend that everything would somehow be okay. But he knew that wasn't fair to them. They deserved to know what was really happening, no matter how painful it would be. And Ethan knew that without their support, the battle ahead in court would be even more difficult. One quiet evening after dinner, Ethan sat them down in the living room. Emma, at 19, had always been the more sensitive and perceptive of the two. Liam, 17, was quieter and more reserved, but both of them had noticed the tension in the house. They could tell that something was wrong. Ethan could see the concern in their eyes. But what he was about to tell them would be worse than they could have imagined. "Dad, is everything okay?" Emma asked softly, sensing that whatever was coming wasn't good. Ethan took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He had gone over this conversation in his head 1,000 times. But now that the moment was here, words seemed to fail him. How do you tell your children that their mother has betrayed them? How do you explain the kind of pain that tears families apart? "There's something I need to talk to you both about," he began, his voice quieter than usual. "It's about your mom." Emma and Liam exchanged worried glances. "What's going on?" Liam asked, his tone more serious now. Ethan paused, struggling to find the right way to start. "Your mom hasn't been honest with us," he said finally, his throat tightening. "She's been seeing someone else for a while now." Emma gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Liam's face went pale. Neither of them had expected this. The room felt suffocating, the air heavy with the weight of Ethan's words. "I didn't want you to find out this way," Ethan continued, his eyes filling with tears he tried desperately to hold back. "I wanted to protect you both from this, but I can't keep it from you any longer. She's been seeing Dylan. You know him, the tennis coach." Emma's face crumpled in disbelief. "Dylan? Mom's been with Dylan?" Her voice cracked as she spoke, the shock quickly turning to anger. "How could she do this to us? To you?" Liam sat silently, his fist clenched in his lap, staring at the floor. Ethan knew this was hitting them hard, and the worst part was, it wasn't even the full truth yet. "There's more," Ethan said, hating that he had to continue. "It's not just the affair. She's been planning to leave us, to leave me, after your college tuition is paid off. But that's not all. She's been planning to accuse me of things I didn't do, to make it look like I hurt her. She wants to ruin me so she can take everything." Emma stood up, her face flushed with anger and confusion. "That's not true. Mom wouldn't do that. She couldn't. She loves us." "I wish it wasn't true," Ethan said, his voice breaking slightly. "But I've seen the messages. I've seen the evidence. She's been planning this for a long time, Emma. I didn't want to believe it either." Liam finally looked up, his eyes wet with unshed tears. "Why?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Why would she do this, Dad? What did we do wrong?" Ethan's heart shattered at the sight of his son's pain. He wanted to wrap them both in his arms and take all the hurt away, but he couldn't. There was no easy way out of this. "This isn't your fault," Ethan said firmly, kneeling down in front of Liam, his hands on his son's knees. "None of this is your fault. Your mom made her own choices, and they have nothing to do with you or Emma. I don't know why she's done this, but I need you to know that I'm here for you, always." Emma sank back down onto the couch, tears streaming down her face. "What's going to happen now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Are we going to lose everything?" Ethan shook his head. "No, I'm fighting this. I've been gathering evidence, and we'll go to court. I just need you both to be strong for me, okay? I need you on my side. I didn't want to drag you into this, but it's going to get messy, and I don't want you to be blindsided by anything." Lion wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, still trying to make sense of it all. "We're with you, Dad," he said, his voice stronger now. "No matter what happens, we're with you." Emma nodded, still crying but resolute. "She betrayed us too," she whispered. "How could she do this to us, after everything?" Ethan hugged them both, pulling them close as they cried into his shoulders. He had tried to prepare himself for this moment, but nothing could have readied him for the pain of watching his children's hearts break in front of him. This wasn't just about the betrayal of a marriage. It was the shattering of a family. But as they sat there, holding on to each other, Ethan knew that they would make it through. He had been honest with them. and they were on his side. Together, they would face whatever came next. This wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. One where they would have to rebuild, one where trust had been broken but love remained. And no matter how hard it got, Ethan promised himself that he would never let Laura's betrayal take away the bond he had with his children. They had each other, and for Ethan, that was enough. The courtroom drama. The day of the court hearing finally arrived. For weeks, Ethan had prepared himself for this moment, but nothing could fully erase the tension he felt walking into the courthouse. It was the culmination of all the evidence he had gathered, every careful step he had taken to protect himself and his children. Now, it was time to put everything on the line. As Ethan sat at the plaintiff's table, his lawyer, Michael Harris, sat beside him, a man with a calm, commanding presence. Michael had been a family attorney for over 2 decades, and Ethan trusted him completely. He knew the stakes were high, and Michael had promised to fight for Ethan with everything he had. On the other side of the courtroom sat Laura, her face a mixture of nervousness and defiance. She glanced over at Ethan only once, before quickly looking away. Sitting next to her was Dylan, cool and composed, as if none of this affected him in the slightest. It was clear he thought they would get away with it. But Ethan knew better. The evidence was solid, the truth undeniable. Still, there was always a sliver of doubt, the fear that somehow Laura and Dylan might twist things in their favor. He had seen people lie under oath before, manipulate situations, and come out on top. But this time, he was determined not to let that happen. The judge, a stern-looking woman with years of experience, entered the courtroom and called the session to order. After the formalities were done, it was time for each side to present their case. Laura's lawyer was the first to speak. He painted a picture of Laura as a victim, someone who had been in an emotionally distant marriage, who felt neglected and unloved. According to him, Laura was forced to seek comfort elsewhere because Ethan had abandoned her emotionally, focusing on his career rather than his family. He hinted at stress, at depression, trying to elicit sympathy from the judge. There was even an implication that Ethan's behavior had been controlling at times, though no solid evidence was provided to support the claim. Ethan sat silently as the lies poured out, keeping his composure. He had expected this. He knew Laura would try to play the victim, to twist the truth. But he trusted Michael to handle it. When it was time for Michael to present Ethan's side of the story, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. Michael stood confidently and began to lay out the evidence, starting with the facts, the text between Laura and Dylan, the financial records, the secret meetings documented by the private investigator. Each piece of evidence was methodically presented, leaving no room for interpretation. The courtroom was silent as the messages between Laura and Dylan were read aloud. Each text was more damning than the last, revealing not only their affair but their plans to destroy Ethan's life. They had openly discussed using false claims of abuse to gain the upper hand in the divorce, and they had planned to live off Ethan's money once they were rid of him. It was a cold, calculated scheme, and there was no way Laura could deny it now. As the evidence mounted, Laura's expression shifted from defiance to panic. She had hoped that her lies would be enough to sway the court, but now it was clear that the truth was against her. But the most emotional moment came when Michael called Emma and Lime to the stand. Ethan had dreaded this part of the trial, not wanting to put his children in the middle of their parents' battle. But Emma and Lime insisted. They wanted the court to hear the truth from them, to understand the pain they had endured watching their mother betray their family. Emma was the first to testify. As she took the stand, Ethan's heart broke for her. She was only 19, but in that moment, she seemed older, wiser, forced to grow up far too quickly because of the choices her mother had made. Emma spoke clearly, her voice steady but filled with emotion, as she described how she had watched her mother drift away from their family, how she had seen the changes in Laura before she knew the full extent of what was happening. She told the court how devastated she was when Ethan revealed the truth to her and her brother, how they had felt betrayed not just by Laura's affair, but by the cold, calculated way she had planned to tear their family apart. Lion was next. Though only 17, he handled himself with maturity beyond his years. He described how his relationship with his mother had deteriorated over time, how he felt like she had been living a double life, lying to him and his sister while plotting against their father. His testimony was brief but powerful, leaving the courtroom silent as the judge listened intently. When the children were done, it was clear that the tide had turned. No amount of lies could erase the emotional weight of their words. The judge looked at Laura with something close to disgust. This wasn't just a case of infidelity. It was a betrayal on every level, and everyone in the room could feel it. As the trial came to a close, it was time for the judge to give her ruling. Ethan held his breath, his hands clenched tightly together under the table. He had done everything he could to prepare for this moment, but now it was out of his hands. The judge's decision was swift. She ruled in Ethan's favor, granting him full custody of the children and dismissing Laura's claims of abuse as baseless. Laura would not receive the financial windfall she had hoped for. In fact, the judge ordered her to pay back a portion of the money she had siphoned from their accounts. Dylan, too, wasn't off the hook. With evidence of his involvement in various financial schemes, he faced a separate legal battle of his own. As the verdict was read, Ethan felt an overwhelming sense of relief. It was over. The lies, the manipulation, the betrayal, it was all out in the open now, and justice had been served. Laura sat in stunned silence, unable to comprehend how everything had fallen apart. Dylan, ever the opportunist, looked like he was already planning his next move, but it was too late. Their plan had failed. Ethan walked out of the courtroom with his head held high. It wasn't just about winning the case. It was about reclaiming his life. He had faced the darkest chapter of his life and emerged stronger. He had protected his children, his career, and his future. For Laura, the courtroom was only the beginning of her downfall. Her social circle, once filled with friends, now turned their backs on her. She was left alone to face the consequences of her actions. And Dylan? His schemes finally caught up with him. He would soon face his own legal troubles, and prison was a very real possibility. But for Ethan, this was a new beginning. He had fought back against betrayal, and in the end, he had won. He knew there was still a long road ahead, rebuilding trust with his children, healing from the emotional wounds. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. The worst was behind him, and now he could focus on the future. The aftermath and karma. As Ethan walked out of the courthouse that day, the weight of the past few months slowly began to lift off his shoulders. For so long, he had been living in a nightmare, betrayed by the woman he loved, his life turned upside down by lies and deception. But now, justice had been served. He had fought back, and he had won. Still, it wasn't as if everything magically went back to normal. There were scars, both seen and unseen. Emma and Lion were still struggling with the reality of their mother's betrayal. They loved her once, and even though they were hurt and angry, they couldn't just erase those feelings overnight. Ethan understood that healing would take time for all of them. In the weeks following the trial, Laura's life fell apart. The friends she had counted on, the ones who had believed her lies, slowly drifted away. No one wanted to be associated with her once the truth came out. She tried to reach out to Emma and Liam, but they weren't ready to forgive her. They needed space, time to process the depth of her betrayal. For Laura, this was the real punishment, not just the financial loss or the public humiliation, but the fact that she had lost her children's trust. Dylan, on the other hand, faced an entirely different fate. The legal battle wasn't over for him. The court had found enough evidence of his involvement in multiple financial schemes, and soon he would be facing his own charges for fraud. What had started as a plan to live off Ethan's money ended with Dylan looking at a possible prison sentence. Karma had finally caught up with him. For Ethan, the aftermath was bittersweet. Yes, he had won the court case, and yes, Dylan and Laura were facing the consequences of their actions. But it was hard to feel triumphant when so much had been lost. The life he had known was gone forever, replaced by something new, something unfamiliar. He had his children by his side, and for that, he was grateful. But the home they had once shared was now filled with memories that were hard to bear. Slowly, though, Ethan began to rebuild. He poured himself into his work, finding solace in the routine of the hospital. Saving lives had always given him a sense of purpose, and now more than ever, it helped him move forward. But it wasn't just work that brought healing. It was the little moments too. The time spent with Emma and Liam, laughing over dinner or watching a movie together. Those moments reminded Ethan that they still had each other, that despite everything, their family had survived. About a year after the trial, Ethan met someone new, Sophia. She was kind, understanding, and had a calmness about her that put him at ease. Sophia wasn't part of the chaos of his past, and being with her allowed Ethan to look toward the future without the weight of old wounds dragging him down. Their relationship developed slowly, naturally, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like he could breathe again. As Ethan's personal life improved, so did his professional one. His reputation as a top heart surgeon continued to grow, and he was soon offered the position of head of surgery at a prestigious hospital. It was an opportunity he had dreamed of for years, and now, with his life back on track, He was finally ready to accept it. Looking back, Ethan realized that what had nearly destroyed him had also made him stronger. He had faced betrayal, humiliation, and loss, but he hadn't let it define him. Instead, he had rebuilt his life, piece by piece, with patience and determination. He had protected his children, secured his future, and found happiness again, this time, with someone who truly valued him. Laura, on the other hand, continued to struggle. Without the financial support she had expected from the divorce, and with her social circle in shambles, she found herself increasingly isolated. The glamorous life she had envisioned with Dylan was nothing more than a distant memory, and she was left to face the consequences of her actions alone. As for Dylan, his fate was sealed. The fraud charges stuck, and he was sentenced to several years in prison. His charm and manipulative ways, which had helped him for so long, were useless now. He had built his life on lies, and eventually, those lies had caught up with him. Prison was his karma. Ethan didn't take pleasure in their downfall, but there was a sense of closure in knowing that the people who had tried to destroy him had been held accountable. It wasn't revenge, it was justice. The truth had come out, and in the end, everyone had gotten what they deserved. But more than anything, Ethan was grateful. Grateful for the strength he hadn't known he possessed. Grateful for the love and support of his children. And grateful for the second chance at life that had come after so much darkness. Life wasn't perfect. It never is. But it was good. Ethan had survived the storm, and now he was ready for whatever came next. Conclusion and reflection. As Ethan stood at the window of his new home, looking out at the sunset, he couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. The past year had been the hardest of his life, a year filled with betrayal, heartbreak, and moments where he wasn't sure he could keep going. But here he was, standing on the other side of it all, stronger than he ever thought possible. There was a time when Ethan thought his life had been ruined. Laura's betrayal had cut in deeply, not just as a husband, but as a father. He had built his world around his family, and when that foundation crumbled, it felt like everything was falling apart. But the truth was, sometimes life has to break you down before you can rebuild it. And rebuild it he did. It wasn't easy. There were nights when Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he'd ever truly heal. But every day he woke up, put one foot in front of the other, and kept moving forward. He focused on his children, on his career, on the things that gave his life meaning. Slowly, the pieces of his life began to come together again. Looking back, Ethan realized that what happened wasn't just a story of betrayal. It was a story of resilience. He had faced the unimaginable, but he had survived. More than that, he had come out of it with a renewed sense of who he was and what he was capable of. He had learned to trust himself again, to trust his instincts, and to find strength in the love he had for his children. Emma and Lime had been his anchors through it all. Their bond had grown even stronger after the trial. They had been hurt by their mother's actions, but they hadn't let it break them. Instead, they stood by their father, supporting him just as he had supported them. Together, they had faced the storm, and together, they had made it through. Now, as Ethan looked to the future, he didn't see the broken pieces of the past anymore. Instead, he saw the possibilities ahead of him. He had found love again with Sophia, someone who understood him and loved him for who he was, not for what he could provide. And with his career at an all-time high, he had a renewed sense of purpose and excitement for what was to come. But perhaps the most important lesson Ethan had learned was that life doesn't end with betrayal. Yes, it hurts. Yes, it changes you, but it doesn't define you. What defines you is how you choose to respond, whether you let it destroy you or whether you use it as a stepping stone to rebuild something even stronger. Ethan chose the latter. He had refused to let Laura's actions control his future. Instead, he had taken control of his own life, deciding that he wouldn't be a victim of someone else's choices. And because of that, he had found peace, happiness, and a new beginning. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the room, Ethan smiled to himself. He knew there would still be challenges ahead. Life was never easy, but he was ready. He had been through the worst, and he had come out stronger. In the end, Ethan had learned the most valuable lesson of all. No matter how dark things get, there's always light on the other side. You just have to keep moving toward it.